Today we're going to go over a case study. This is supposed to be representative of what I'm expecting for the final. I'm going to do another one on Wednesday, but today we're going to be talking about the environment. So, Engineering Code of Ethics states engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All right, so before we get started, I want to talk about something that's really important to a lot of people is this chemical called DHMO. It has a ton of uses. It's a short list, but it is a lot of the major uses for this chemical. It's sometimes called hydroxylized acid. The acronym that it spells out, it's very technical, it's difficult to pronounce. And the reason it's so popular for all of this stuff is because it's cheap and effective. It's used in power plants, it's used in plastic production, it's a fire suppressant. It's some nasty stuff. People don't like a lot of the side effects associated with DHMO. The first is it's one of the major ingredients in nearly every illegal drug component. Drug manufacturing. It's known that the withdrawal from this chemical is death. That is one of the key symptoms of the withdrawal. You die. It causes 4,000 overdoses every year. It causes 6,000 to 7,000 deaths due to solid exposure. There's 6,000 to 7,000 deaths due to impure consumption. 7.2 million people get sick from this stuff every year. There's more than 500,000 ER visits because of this stuff. It's super addictive. It contributes to greenhouse gas effects. It causes residential equipment to fail. It causes erosion, corrosion, electrical failures. If your car is failing, it's really easy to find this stuff on it. So, does anybody know what this chemical is? Well, if you haven't figured it out already, DHMO stands for dihydrogen monoxide, or H2O. This is water. Water does all of this stuff. So why did I present it this way? Why am I bringing it up? It's very common for people who think that they're helping. So environmentalists do this a lot, and it's usually unintentional, where they paint something to be horrific without giving clear explanation as to what's going on. I don't think they do this intentionally. I think it's unintentional. But it becomes clear once you have all of the context of the situation that they're really just being self-serving. And when I don't know about you guys, but when it becomes clear to me that somebody I'm working with or somebody who's talking to me is being self-serving, I become very critical of what they're saying, to the point that I either stop listening to them or I just stop trusting them. When I was in high school, I had Mr. Johnson, very smart guy. He was very pro-environment, and he gave us this report. And in the report, if you read it, really it was this physicist had gone and taken all these computer models, and he had figured out based off the computer models what we should expect for the growth of the sea levels, how high you should expect it to be in the next 10 to 15 years. Unfortunately, somebody had taken that report and out of context cited that the report said that the sea levels would rise 300 feet. Now, the thing is, and this is super important when it comes to the discussion of rising sea levels, there's an actual upper limit of how high the sea level can rise. It's high, it's bad news for most people, but it's not as high as you would think. You can only raise the sea levels 180 feet. Well, this report that I was reading, my teacher had me read, said it went up to 300 feet. And it's just because the person who had taken the original report extrapolated out to 200 years from now, and it said 300 feet. Had you read the actual report, its prediction was only good for 5 to 10 years, and at the end of 5 to 10 years, you could expect certain weather events to cause sea levels to rise a certain number, but not anywhere near the 300 number. And so a lot of people, when we talk about the environment, interpret what the environmentalists have to say through this lens of, are you a scientist and do you know what you're talking about, or are you just repeating what you think you understood? And so you don't, if you find that you are an environmentalist, you don't want to be that guy where what you say gets taken out of context. And it's an uphill fight because a lot of people do this thinking that they're helping by dramatizing the situation, but really it has the opposite effect. And so to a certain extent, and I do care deeply about the environment, but I do think environmentalists need to take a step back sometimes because it does sound like what they're doing is dramatization of the situation instead of what's actually happening. So this is a direct quote from the EPA. A lot of our priorities are set by public opinion, and the public quite often is more worried about things that they perceive to cause greater risks than things that really cause risks. Our priorities oftentimes are set through Congress, and those decisions may or may not reflect real risk. They may reflect people's opinions of risks or congressmen's opinions of risk. So I want you to think about that. How often have you heard or seen somebody warn you about something bad going on in the environment? And how much of that was just what they perceived to be dangerous, and how much of that was an actual danger? So let's talk about electric vehicles. A lot of people, when they say, hey, you should buy an electric vehicle, some of the things they state is buying an electric vehicle will increase air quality because they don't produce any carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. They produce fewer climate changing emissions, such as gasoline. EVs can reduce waste through recycling and repurposing of materials, and EVs can have safer manufacturing processes. Now, I want you to think about that. How much of this is actually true? Do electric cars actually improve the air quality? Do they negatively affect the air quality? Are they indifferent? Or is it depends on the scenario? Depends on where you're getting your electricity from. So it's a true statement that they don't use gasoline or diesel, but if their power is coming from an electric power plant that runs on propane, it does generate some CO2. It owns some of the responsibility for some of the CO2 generated by that power plant. Now, the next is the waste reduction. Is that necessarily true? Yeah, a lot of that car can get reused, but the more dangerous part of that car is the battery. Batteries are expensive to replace and recycle. Is somebody going to actually follow through with that decision? The last is it genuinely safer to manufacture these? The answer is it depends. It depends on where it's being manufactured. Is it being manufactured in the US where we have relatively high work standards? Is it being manufactured in Latin America or Asia where standards aren't so high? It depends. So this is an example of the Model 3 long range. Um, I'm not showing all the math, but I think you'll get the idea here. So if it has a range of 358 miles on this battery, that means that the battery needs to hold 315 kilowatt hours to work. Rhode Island uses 91% natural gas for the electric grid. This leads to what's equivalent to 123 pounds of CO2, which is roughly equivalent to having a car efficiency of 60 miles per gallon. That 60 miles per gallon is roughly equivalent to a 2023 Toyota Prius LE hatchback. So in the event that you're just buying some Tesla, in terms of just CO2, the environmental offset you're having is roughly equivalent to a Prius. Now, in both cases, they do have some kind of fancy schmancy lithium battery. The Tesla's battery is much larger. The Prius's battery is roughly the size of a regular car battery. And I think I've told this story before, but it's worth telling again just to make a point. When I lived in Georgia, I encountered on the highway a lot of signs saying, "Do not stop in front of Mack trucks." And the reason for this is because the state of Georgia had an actual law saying if you brake checked a Mack truck or if you just stopped on the highway in front of a Mack truck that was doing 60 miles an hour, you owned all of the damages. And you might ask, why would you do that? Why would they make that law? Is Georgia that backwards? No, it's not. What they found was happening in Georgia was instead of paying to throw your car away, people would brake check Mack trucks and then try to get insurance money out of it. And this became such a large problem that they actually changed the laws, and it stopped happening. I want you to think about what would happen if you got rear-ended by a Mack truck doing 60 miles an hour. How much damage to you, not talking about financial, how much damage to you would occur if that happened? You'd probably break a bone. Your neck and back would be permanently damaged. And people were choosing to do this. Why would they choose to do this? Well, they weren't thinking, but to them, this was a good option. And so if somebody's willing to do that, what else are they willing to do just to save a few dollars? Well, and this is the part of the story where I think I've told this story before, but when my parents went to URI, there was an incident where they pulled a car out of the pond at the bottom of the hill. And when they pulled that car out, they realized there were other cars in the pond, and they just started pulling car after car after car out of the pond. And the reason they were doing this is because they were saying the car had gotten stolen, and they'd get the insurance money. Knowing that people will do some dumb things for insurance money, do you think people would be willing to throw their Tesla or their Prius into the ocean or some pond so that they could get insurance money. So they don't personally have to pay for those damages. Further, have you ever inherited a car that probably should have been thrown away? Would you ensure responsible disposal of that vehicle if it failed before securing steady employment? Next is, how much lithium do you think you need to contaminate a water supply? So the reason I'm sharing these stories with the class is to highlight a pattern I've observed in many special interest groups. They often appear less genuine than they claim. This isn't to say that everyone with a passion or concern is dishonest, but there are subtle signs that raise questions about their true intention. For example, consider the campaign to protect Narragansett and Newport Bays. Its stated aim was to maintain water purity and protect whales. However, the waters were already fairly clean, and notably, there were no whales in these bays. A closer look at the campaign backers revealed that they were mostly owners of luxury yachts, seemingly more concerned about sharing waterways with large vessels than environmental conservation. Further, in discussions about environmental consciousness, I've noticed a trend amongst people who purchase Tesla ostensibly to save the environment. Often it seems like a display of wealth, given that more affordable and practical options, such as a Prius, are available. These alternatives are cheaper by about $10,000 and don't require extensive modifications to achieve similar environmental benefits. All right, so we're going to talk about hindsight analysis and contemporary understanding. So there's a saying, everything's obvious, or everything's 2020 in hindsight, meaning if you knew the outcome, you'd know that what you're about to do is a bad decision. But the point they're trying to make with those statements is a lot of times you don't have all of the information to make a good decision. And the only information you have is historical data. Um, so let's go from there. So I've assigned you a task related to an emerging technology, a field where the boundaries of what is ethical are often blurred or not yet fully understood. The reason for this focus is straightforward yet profound. In your careers, understanding and identifying ethical issues in advance is vital. The nature of technology is such that we often don't realize the ethical implications until after they've emerged, but by then it can be too late to effectively address them. What I want for each of you is to develop the skills to foresee these issues, to form opinions that are not only coherent and agreeable, but also influential. It's about being a step ahead, thinking critically and responsibly about the impact of new technologies. To illustrate this, we will review a case where ethical concerns were raised after the fact, even after substantial scientific investigation. We'll discuss why these issues were initially overlooked or ignored and what we can learn from this oversight. The goal here is not to just understand what went wrong, but more importantly, to equip you with the foresight and insight needed to prevent similar issues in your future work. All right, so as we go forward, I want you to do your best to put yourself in the shoes of the people we're talking about. I don't want to hear how, you know what the aftermath is, so obviously there's a right answer. You're not going to be in that situation in 5 to 10 years. You're not. You're going to be in their shoes in 5 to 10 years. So you want to try to put yourself in these people's shoes now so you can see why they made the decisions they made and what information they did have access to that they ignored. And then I want you to think about what information you have access to that you might not be looking at. These people had major economic hardships. Um, I want you to think, have there been times in your life when food was scarce and you didn't know where your next meal was coming from? Right now, we're going through a period of high inflation, but nothing compared to what these people had. Um, their inflation, in certain places of the world, people would insist on getting paid in the morning so they could give money to their spouses so they could go shopping because they knew by the end of the day everything would be too expensive to purchase. At the same time, employment plummeted. So there were a lot of people who had just nothing. Then these people, they were children when this happened, where they were going hungry, and then a major war started. Now, this stabilized the economy, which was great for the economy, but entire families were being torn apart. They would have to go overseas, and a lot of times they never came back. Um, if you were between the ages of 18 and 30 when the war started, you got drafted, you got thrown into this conflict, whether you liked it or not, and then you got to see some of the worst atrocities the world has ever seen. And then you came back after you saw all these atrocities, after you got traumatized, you lost friends, you witnessed some of the most inhumane acts, and you grappled with survival guilt, constantly questioning why you were spared when so many others weren't. Um, so at this point, I think about half of you are probably in the shoes of where I want you to be. I'm going to tell this story because the point is I'm trying to push you the rest of the way if you're only halfway there. So my grandfather grew up during the Depression. His family didn't have a lot of money. He worked as a child, so he'd have income, so he could make sure that he could afford food. And then he got drafted, and he was a paratrooper. Um, One of his major jobs, once he, landed, was to climb mountains, scout, figure out what he could see, radio down the things he was seeing, and then he would tell the artillery where to aim. So one of the instances when he climbed one of the mountains, when he got to the top, he saw what looked like a fortified location. However, it looked abandoned. So he radioed down and said, "Hey, there's this location. It looks fortified, probably has stuff we should go get. Just letting you know." When he gets to the bottom of the mountain, his commander says, "Based off of what you said, we think you're correct. We think the location's abandoned, but we want you to go because we don't have any mountains nearby and we're moving." So he goes to this location and he goes in, and it was a camp that had been abandoned. It was a concentration camp. And there, when I say abandoned, it was abandoned by the Germans. There were still people there. The doors were still locked, and they had no food. He described skeletons and zombies when he walked in. And the first thing he did was take his rations, because you would carry your food with you everywhere you went. They just unloaded. They gave him all the food they had. These guys that were in this camp ate the food as fast as they could, but then they would start to puke because they hadn't eaten in such a long time that some of the food they were eating they couldn't digest. Um, Before this event, my grandfather was very openly racist. After this event, my grandfather's attitude towards diversity and treating everybody equally and all that jazz had a whole paradigm shift. Um, I don't know whether my grandfather murdered somebody after that, but I know he went to the closest French town and said, "Do you know about this?" And when they said yes, but, they're Jews, why should we care? He proceeded to raid everyone's house, taking all of their food and bringing it back to that camp. And I know it wasn't a do you mind sharing? He just took, because at that point of how disgusted he was with these people. All right, so these people who have gone through these traumas are now home. And during the war, they realized that there was a chemical that was really good at killing pests. And one of the biggest issues when it comes to scarcity with food comes back to pests. There was a long period of time in the US and most of the world where you would actually have to write off a certain percentage of your crops to bugs. You'd have to say the bugs get to own this. And with the introduction of some pesticides, you don't have to anymore. Just using this pesticide made the bugs go away. And you could now have a predictable amount of food every year. Because of this, you know, literally you'd get more food, but because of the predictability of it, you could plan better. And this actually caused the cost of food in the US to drop. And this is an odd thing because typically prices of things like food don't go down. Prices of food are supposed to go up regularly, and they do, but in this period of time it was very unique. Prices went down. It was because there was this reliable source of food. And this reliable source of food only existed because of the pesticides. Now, the pesticide we're going to talk about is DDT. It was very widespread used. It had little to no effect on humans. They couldn't identify any long-term effects. So both industry and government agreed we should be using this. And industry and government agreeing on something tends to not happen very often. Diphenyl trichloroethane. It was introduced in the 40s. It really was a game changer. It effectively made malaria and typhus just go away. You no longer had to worry about things like termites eating your house. There were places that would intentionally not build a house to last more than 10 years because they knew they would lose the fight to bugs. Because they were able to make long-term decisions, long-term planning. This increased crop yield, livestock yields. However, there was a link to a decrease in the wild animal population in the 50s because you're killing the bottom rung of the food chain. And there was cancer formations in the 1960s. Um, 50s, there was a very high prevalence of what is known as PTSD. During the 1950s, many veterans likely suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD. You know, seeing your friends die, experiencing intense combat would have profound psychological effects. However, PTSD wasn't officially recognized until the 80s, and the understanding of psychology trauma was limited in the 50s. The condition was often downplayed or stigmatized. Terms like shell shock or battle fatigue were used, and many veterans were expected to just tough it out, move on, get over it, without adequate support or understanding of their mental health. So imagine that you're somebody who has PTSD, and you go to sleep every night, and in your dreams, you still see these dead bodies, you still see your friends die, you're talking to your friends, and when you wake up, you realize that it was just a dream, and you're having a lot of problems. And then your nephew, who has never had to deal with any of these traumas, starts talking to you about the frogs and how the frogs aren't as populous as they were, and how you you need to, let the cost of food go up to save the frogs. Are you going to have the attitude of, yeah, let's save these frogs, let's save these birds, or would you have the attitude of, what the hell are you talking about? This is a trivial problem and I'm not getting involved. The reality is that's mostly what happened. The people who had PTSD felt disconnected from this problem, and they didn't want to be associated with it because they had real problems. And saving the bugs and saving the frogs and saving the birds was not on their list of things to care about. The mental and emotional burden that they were dealing with simply overshadowed any other welfare that came along. If a person is struggling with the haunting memories of war, it's extremely dehumanizing to suddenly have somebody come up to you and say, let's save the birds. No, that person needs to be taken care of, not the birds. They might feel that their own profound suffering and that their fellow humans are being overlooked. This could potentially lead to the feeling of dehumanization and marginalization. It's important to understand this within the context of the times. The 1950s were a period of great change and adjustment within societal focus, largely on economic growth. The Cold War and conforming to a sense of normalcy after the upheavals of war. I was just talking about the soldiers, people who actually had to deal with these traumas. There were plenty of people who had other problems, bigger problems. During this time frame, many African American soldiers served their country with honor and courage, even as they often encountered discrimination and segregation in the armed forces. The idea of asking these Americans to set aside their own struggles for civil rights to prioritize the birds was also very dehumanizing. Research has indicated that there may be a correlation between exposure to DDT and an increased risk of certain types of cancer, including breast cancer. Studies have found that in areas where DDT contamination was present in the water supply or in the environment, there were higher rates of breast cancers compared to areas with lower DDT exposure. However, it's important to note that while these correlations exist, the causation link between DDT and cancer is complex and not fully understood. In contrast, the link between smoking and cancer is well established and widely recognized. Smoking is a known major risk factor in various types of cancer, including lung, throat, and mouth cancer, among others. Public health campaigns have long emphasized the importance of quitting to reduce the risk of cancer and other health issues. So at this point, if you're not going to class, I want you to send me an email. Do you think that DDT was approved of at this time? Even the people who understood the importance of saving the birds understood the trade-off wasn't appropriate. If DDT wasn't used, then the price of food would go up. If the price of food went up, the poor would be the first to feel the effects and they would die. Is it possible to quantify how many of these people should die to save the birds? Now, I want you to think about what the public is thinking about during this time frame. Being regulatory bodies in the 50s. So the FDA existed, and it considered DDT to be safe up to 7 parts per million. The USDA provided it to farmers as early as 1945. Now, some of the public proposed complete bans on pesticides. At the time, there were little to no alternatives. Um, the complete ban was totally struck down. It They didn't even propose like reasonable reductions. It was just complete ban versus complete use. And the honest truth is, at the time, a complete ban would be worse than not using it. So, what responsibilities did corporate have? Chemical companies recognized the public skepticism towards extensive pesticide use, and they did research and development towards finding alternatives to DDT that are less prone to pest resistance and require minimal application. The industry is informed by evolutionary biology and poison resistance, striving to communicate effectively with the public about the importance of pesticides in maintaining food supply and prices. There's a need to demonstrate that despite their side effects, current pesticides may be a more viable option compared to the potential consequences of their complete removal. Overcoming public resistance to education is a significant challenge that requires strategic communication and genuine dialogue. So, this is one of the subject matter experts on DDT. Her name is Rachel Carson. She was funded by the Audubon Society. She wrote a very famous book called Silent Spring, and she used this book to campaign. I need to point out that being paid to do research doesn't make you unethical. She very publicly stated that she was being funded by the Audubon Society. Lying or hiding your funding source is unethical. Additionally, selling a book, especially if it's scientifically factual with a clear message, isn't unethical. She was very open about the fact that she was trying to communicate with the public what DDT did. Carson found two scientific camps: those who dismissed the possible danger of pesticides spraying, barring conclusive proof, and those who were open to the possibility of harm and willing to consider alternative methods such as biological pest control. This is an organization that is in favor of DDT. This is the World Health Organization. As of 2006, WHO declared its support for the indoor use of DDT in African countries where malaria remains a major health problem, citing the benefits of the pesticide heavily outweigh the health and environmental risks. That is to say, typhus and malaria are way worse than cancer, at least from the WHO's point of view. Restrictions. It wasn't until 1973 that DDT was effectively banned, with a few extreme exceptions. Economic alternatives were defined, processes were introduced to reduce the demand of DDT. Now, one thing I would like to say was I talked about federal law. State laws were different, and I just didn't really have time to cover all of it. But I did point out that the FDA cited what the safe dosage of DDT was. It was 7 parts per million. You could get higher than that, and you could kill somebody with it, if that was your intent. In some cities, like Boston, and I'm not exaggerating the story, there were a handful of people who would live in apartment complexes, and they would fumigate the entire apartment complex without notifying anybody else. And they would fill the building with DDT, and they'd kill people. And sometimes their justification was they didn't understand that DDT was lethal. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that is what they said. And there were some state level restrictions. There were some restrictions in the sense that only certain people could buy it and only certain people could use it. But there were no real heavy bans on this stuff until 1973. I think in one instance, Massachusetts tried to ban it not because they were trying to save the birds, but because they'd have like their own little garden, and the way they were using the DDT, they'd effectively fumigate their neighbor's house, and they would kill the neighbor's dog. And this became such a prevalent problem that some states would say the general public isn't allowed to buy this because people are doing this.